In this lecture, we're going to swap the players' weapons. Initially, all players should begin with an axe. If they complete the quest, the axe will be replaced with the sword. Unity has a simple method for toggling the appearance of a game object. It'll be as simple as one line of code. First, let's prepare the tags. Before we can toggle the game objects, we must have a reference to them. In the previous lecture, we added tags to both objects. To avoid typos, we should create constants. Open the class. At the bottom of the class, add a constant. It'll be called axeTag. Set the value to axe. Next, create another constant for the sword. The name and value will be sword. Preparing the constants is always a good step. The values for the constant should match the casing from Unity. After creating these constants, let's begin selecting the game objects. Open the player controller. First, let's grab the constants. At the top of the file, add the rpg.utility namespace. Next, let's create variables for storing references to the objects. In the class, define a variable called axeWeapon. Its type will be the game object class. As we know, the game object class is the proper class for variables storing a reference to game objects. Let's define another variable for storing the sword object. It'll have the same modifier and type. The name of the variable will be called swordWeapon. Let's grab the objects. In the awake method, set the axeWeapon variable to the gameObject.findGameObject with tag constants.axeTag method. For the swordWeapon variable, set the value to the same method but with the sword tag constant. After selecting the objects, let's create a variable to track the current weapon. At the top of the class, define a public variable called weapon with the weapon's enum as the type. Set the initial value to weapons.axe. Initially, the player is going to be using the axe as their weapon. By keeping track of the player's weapon, we can decisively toggle the correct weapon. Scroll to the start method. In this method, let's run a method called setWeapon. We're going to outsource the logic for toggling the weapon in a separate method. Weapons should be set when the game starts. In addition, the weapon should be updated after completing a quest. By outsourcing the logic, we can reuse it in multiple locations. At the bottom of the class, define this method. In this method, we're going to create a conditional statement. The condition will be the following. Weapon equals weapons.axe. If the current weapon is the axe, we'll display it. In the conditional block, call the axeWeapon.setActive method. Previously, we enabled and disabled components. However, disabling game objects is a different story. By calling this method, we're toggling the active status of an entire game object. If we disable a game object, all components on the game object become disabled. We must pass in a boolean for setting the status of the game object. In this case, we want the axe game object to be active. Let's pass in true. Next, let's disable the sword weapon by calling the swordWeapon.setActive method. Let's put in false. But what if the player wants to hold the sword? Let's add an else statement. If the current weapon is not an axe, we should display the sword. I'm going to copy and paste the code from the if statement. Next, I'm going to reverse the values passed in. The method is ready. This code should toggle the weapons. However, the weapon will only be set at the start of the game. It won't get updated when the player is rewarded. We must update the handleReward method to set the weapon. In this method, we're going to create a conditional statement. The condition will be the reward.forceWeaponSwap variable. Before updating the weapon, we should check that the reward gives a weapon. If the player can upgrade their weapon, let's update the weapon variable to the reward.weapon variable. Next, call the setWeapon method to upgrade the player's weapon. We're finished. Toggling the player's weapon is as simple as calling a single method called setActive. Whenever you need to disable a game object completely, you should always use this method. It doesn't destroy the game object. It simply disables it from the game. Let's try testing our work. Head over to Unity to play the game. In the beginning, the player is wielding an axe. As for the sword, it's completely gone. Let's look at the hierarchy. I'm going to view the player's slot object. As you can see, both objects are in the hierarchy. Game objects that are disabled are not destroyed. The sword game object has been disabled, which is indicated by the grayed out text. I'm going to complete the quest. After completing the quest, my weapon was changed to a sword. Perfect. This is exactly what we wanted. I've completed the section of this course. The goal was to implement a fully functioning quest and reward system. It's a standard feature for most RPG games. In the next section, let's add a new level to our game. When you're ready, I'll see you there.